Hello and welcome to AFI DOCS 2020 presented by AT&T. My name is Sarah Harris. I am Senior Programmer at AFI Festivals, and I'm thrilled that you're here to watch our discussion of The Vote. I want to quickly thank all of our supporters of the festival, including presenting sponsor AT&T, Corporation for Public Broadcasting for this particular film, our AFI members, and all of you, our viewers. So like I said, we are here today with filmmakers and a subject from The Vote, director Michelle Ferrari, and from Johns Hopkins University, Martha S. Jones. Thank you, ladies, for being here today.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you.
So one of the things that I think is really striking and something great to remember is what you've touched on is, this suffrage movement was, 70 plus years in the making. And I think a lot of times today with our internet age and, social media and this idea that everything has to have a rapid response is that we forget how slow social movements can take to really make progress. And the film is a great reminder of all of the different layers and people that have to come together in this long game. But the film also centers kind of in that last decade of the movement. So I'm curious, Michelle, if you could kind of speak to why you decided to focus on that part of suffrage.
There were really three main reasons that we decided to look at the last decade. One is that I feel like to the extent that people know anything about the women's suffrage movement, they tend to know about the earlier period, about the 19th century movement. There had been two prior documentary films. Ken Burns made a film about Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton, Not for Ourselves Alone. And then there was a 1995 movie documentary about the women's suffrage movement called One Woman, One Vote, that dealt primarily with the 19th century. So we felt like there was a real opportunity to fully unpack the last decade, which had never been done before. And then two, it's the moment when the women's suffrage movement becomes a mass movement and it's gaining a whole bunch of momentum. And there's a lot of drama in that last decade, which is catnip to a filmmaker. And then third and finally, it's the most well-documented decade in the movement. It's visually rich. There's tremendous archive, an incredible amount of ephemera related to the movement. And we really felt like we had an opportunity to showcase that material in a way that never had been done before.
And like you said, the earlier part of the movement is more well-known. Susan B. Anthony, I think, is kind of the name associated with the entire social movement. But your film does, it does talk about her, but it brings in these other women who were very much involved in this kind of pushing it over the finish line. And how difficult was it, to take kind of this huge picture and narrow it down to these particular women that you felt really needed to show how the story and the movement progressed?
It was extremely difficult, actually. I mean, this is a movement that over the course of 3 generations engaged the energies of millions of women. Now, most of those women, little or nothing is known about, right? But even there's so many about whom something is known that we had quite a large net that we had to throw around this subject and then whittle down. I think, there were many things that didn't make it into the story, characters, strands of the narrative, there was a very robust suffrage movement in the South, and those women are extremely interesting. But in the end, we had to kind of gravitate toward the characters that advance the narrative. And so, for example, the suffragists in the South were fighting a pretty doomed battle, and their stories didn't really advance the overall narrative, which is how do we get to the 19th Amendment?
Right. And I think this is a great segue into, because the Southern states alone could have been, you could have had a 10-part series just on their efforts alone. And what I appreciate about your film is that we have to talk about racism and we have to acknowledge that the suffrage movement was started amongst middle class or upper class white women, and a lot of historical narratives are told by those who are in control. So obviously a lot of the African American women that did their part are overlooked. And Martha, I'm sure you can speak to this as well. But I guess what are some ways that we can, as we're celebrating the centennial of the 19th Amendment, what are some other ways where we can celebrate this other part of history that is often overlooked?
You know, celebration is a kind of awkward word for a historian like me. I'm not really in the business of celebrating. That's the good news and the bad news, I guess, if you're one of my students. But it means that I see this year and this film as an opportunity to also introduce some new characters and new dynamics and concerns, as you've suggested, racism in particular, into the story that we tell about the road to the 19th Amendment. I don't think for most viewers, the notion that racism is present, is a factor in American life is a new revelation. But through this film, I think we discover the ways in which racist ideas, the dynamics of racism in American politics, the ways in which racism hobbles and limits social movements, and the movement for women's suffrage is a story that either we don't know very well, or we've, in some sense, ascribed to an older, that early version of the story, those early chapters in the 19th century. And part of what this film does is insist that we have to pull that thread all the way through to 1920 and beyond.
Yeah, and I think it is, you know, as I was kind of thinking more holistically, which is what the film really did for me, is made me remember all of the different people involved in it and the overall struggle. You know, remembering that most of the Western states, women already had the right to vote, and you know, they were just kind of pushing everybody else along to get to the 19th Amendment. But also that after that amendment was passed, that the Southern states, you know, there were other intimidation tactics and things like that for a lot of African American women to not be able to vote still. So even though it passed, it doesn't, you know, it's just a stepping stone, so to speak, that you still have these other measures to kind of bring equal rights up to speed. And even to this day, it's very clearly not.
I mean, millions of women voted before the 19th Amendment passed, and millions of women didn't vote after it. And so it was very important to us to kind of figure out what the significance of that amendment is then. And in doing so, I think, you know, it was equally important for us to really clarify something that I think most Americans get wrong, which is they think, you know, that we have a constitutional right to vote. And in fact, we don't. We don't have a constitutional right to vote. It isn't in the Constitution. It's left to the states. And there are now these amendments and the Voting Rights Act, which prohibit discrimination on certain grounds, but states are still free to discriminate on other grounds.
One of the things that I think the film does so well is grapple with the kind of myths that substitute for history, oftentimes in our imaginations. And so this notion, you know, one is that the 19th Amendment guarantees, right, all women the right to vote. No, as Michelle said, right, the individual states continue to mete out voting rights by all kinds of criteria, some of them deeply tinged with racism, but in these years still, for example, people with disabilities, the so-called insane and the infirm are going to be also deprived of the vote, and we live with the legacy of that as well. The other myth is that African American women do not vote after 1920. What we're able to say with confidence now is that African American women vote before the 19th Amendment in many states, perhaps most importantly in states like New York and Illinois and the city of Chicago. But that with the 19th Amendment, African American women will visit registrars, will work to get their names on the rolls, and will show up to the polls in the fall of 1920. Many of them will be rebuffed, and that's, if you will, the next chapter in this story, the next film, that tells that story of that. But I like the term voting rights as a way of connecting Michelle Ferrari's story to the chapters both before it, in the years after the Civil War, when African American men are able to come to the polls in important numbers for the first time, and then all the way forward to the Voting Rights Amendment, and as you've said, Sarah, to our own time, when we live in an era of voter suppression, where many of the kinds of struggles that American women faced in the road to the 19th Amendment are eerily present, I think, in our own time. This makes it a film that really does have important lessons for us today. But I think for me, to say voting rights means that it helps us see the connections between this very special story and the things that come before and after it.
Totally. Well, let's talk a little bit about the archival imagery and some of the sources. Tell us a little bit about, and I mean, Michelle, you can lead off, but I know, Martha, you've obviously with your work, you're digging into all these things as well, but tell us a little bit about where you were able to source a lot of this content and how difficult that must have been. You know, like you said earlier, part of that decade is what had the most content to be able to use in a way.
I would say it was less difficult than with some other stories because there was a plethora of material. I had 2 people working full-time on archival research for the better part of a year. The resulting films are drawn from more than 150 archives. A lot of the materials in the public domain, so from the Library of Congress or the National Archives, a great percentage of it is from smaller collections and individual collectors. But, you know, we have, thankfully, someone like Alice Paul, and this is part of the reason she tends to draw a lot of attention. And she, you know, saw to it that pretty much everything that she did, every action she took was well documented. She invited photographers, she invited newsreel cameramen. And so there is an archive, an extensive archive related to the National Women's Party. Some other aspects of the story were a little bit harder to pull together and took more creative research. But there is a wealth of material out there that we were able to unearth. So,
yeah, I mean, I think to me, some of the most fascinating images were the parade in 1913, just the crowd images of surrounding these women. It was fascinating to see that was captured. And then also the fact that women had the first picket on the White House, I think is not something I realized, but I'm also not surprised by it when you start to think about it.
No, I mean, you know, I like to say that typically, you know, this story gets reduced to about a paragraph, and it starts in 1848 in Seneca Falls, right? And it ends in 1920 with American women being given or granted the right to vote. And, you know, what it skips over is that these women actually pioneered some of the tactics and strategies of civil disobedience that we still use today.
Yeah, it was remarkable to see the kind of you know, foundation of a lot of that kind of peaceful protest coming together, and the media savvy of the time, because it's, you know, the newspaper is probably the one main source of media, and she took full advantage of it.
Right. Well, and in the beginning, you know, prior to the early 1900s, if there were an article about women's suffrage in the newspaper, it tended to mock the meeting or the convention or whatever it was. But by the time you get to the 20th century, women are starting to understand that they have to control their image. and they are marketing themselves and their cause directly. And that is part of the reason there's so much ephemera.
It's one of the things I think that I will celebrate about this year is the recovery, if you will, and the surfacing of these kinds of materials that Michelle has described, right, take hundreds of hours, right, to locate and to bring to light. But now we have that kind of material. We understand it much better, and I think can fold it into stock narratives, into classrooms, into textbooks, right, into all those places where Americans are imbibing their U.S. history and their women's history. We come out of this experience with a different kind of archive, and for me, that's really exciting.
It is. It really is. I mean, I think that, and this alludes kind of back to what we were talking about, but I think when you are learning about suffrage, as you know, through most of your education, the imagery is associated with these white women, and to have this, especially a lot of images with these African American women participating in their clubs and their, the fact that like they're marching in the back of the parade. So there's how many photographs of that really, that you see this parade and you see these white women, so you forget, right? So, I mean, I think that achievement is, congratulations on that, because that is something that is really, I think, incredibly important, and what the progress is progress to make the story correct.
Well, all hail to producer Connie Honey, who is the archival researcher extraordinaire. So.
So I think I've got like one more question, but it's, you both have very deep backgrounds in American history, more so than me, that's for sure. So I found, several things in the film surprising, which I've kind of mentioned, but is there anything in particular as you were researching, or Martha, as you're doing your research, that still surprises you or still kind of stands out as an interesting point in the movement?
There's a way in which I think for the first time, African American women, some of whom, dozens of them, are participants in this march, and hundreds, thousands more, right, are part of the long road to the 19th Amendment. I think for me, I wasn't sure in sort of approaching this year that those women would find a place beyond sort of bit players in the problem of racism. And I think one of the things that this film manages to do is to also contextualize those women who, as you've said, Sarah, come out of their own political movements, out of African American women's clubs, some of them out of the legacy of the anti-slavery movement, many of them associated with civil rights organizations. This is the moment in which those women become full-fledged political actors, thinkers, doers in a very complex story. And so while I would say that's not a surprise to me as someone who's spent a very long time reading and researching and writing about such women, but to see them begin to take center stage in their fullness, I think is, if not surprising, is very important and is new in the telling of this story. So I'm, for one, grateful that a figure like Mary Church Terrell or Ida B. Wells emerges as they emerge as multifaceted, right, complex figures, and not merely adversaries, right, to figures like Alice Paul or Carrie Chapman Catt. They are their own agents. They have their own roles to play in the story of the 19th Amendment.
That means so much to me, Martha. And for you to say that, and obviously, that wouldn't have been possible without your participation. Like, you do so much to bring those women into their fullness. I have a graduate degree in American history. I did not learn about women's suffrage either as an undergraduate or as a graduate student. I think, I'm of an age where when I was in college, I would have had to have been a women's studies major to learn about the women's suffrage movement. So I will say that most everything was a surprise to me. I knew very, very little about it. I think the two most surprising things were, number one, the extent to which racism, the legacy of the Civil War, of Reconstruction, white supremacy was at the heart of the story. I was actually kind of floored by that, and the way in which it acted as an enduring baffle to progress, to women's progress, to racial progress, et cetera. And then two, and Martha spoke to this earlier, it all felt incredibly current. It didn't feel dusty or remote in any way. All of these issues felt very, very current and relatable. And that came as something of a surprise as well to me.
Yeah, I think for me as well, it's one of those things that you think it's the 19th has been around longer than 100 years, and you start to realize it's been just about the amount of time that they fought for it. The film really speaks well to that, puts it in perspective for sure. So I actually want to wrap it up, but I do want to ask if either of you have some other projects coming out. Martha, you have a book coming out later this year. Do you want to talk about
I do. Sure, thank you. Vanguard, how Black women broke barriers, won the vote, and insisted on equality for all, is coming out in September of 2020. And it is a long look at the history of African American women's political activism over 200 years, bringing us right up to 2020. It was a book very much inspired by this anniversary and my commitment to making sure that African American women were fully, their stories were fully told in this anniversary year. But it's also a book that is intended to help us understand better the 21st century African American women's figures who are shaping politics, the Stacey Abrams, Ayanna Pressley, Michelle Obama. Those women don't come out of nowhere. They come out of a 200-year commitment to political power for themselves, but political power that is aimed at really, as someone like Mary Church Terrell would have put it, aimed at bettering all of humanity. So stay tuned for Vanguard. It'll be here in September. And thanks very much for asking.
Michelle, do you have another project you're working on currently, or the next big documentary?
I don't know that I'm at liberty to talk about it yet, actually.
Well, that's okay. I understand how that works. But it's good to be working in archivals, I'm sure, during COVID. So grateful to have you both here, and thank you for sharing your wisdom and just the process of making this project, which I know has a lot of heart and a lot of hard work and sweat behind it. So thank you, and congratulations again on the film. To all of our viewers, the film will continue to screen through June 21st, so you can watch part 1 or part 2. If you skipped ahead and watched our talk first, you can still watch that through the 21st. And we'd love to hear from you on social media, #AFI Dallas. And we have lots of other great films available at docs.afi.com. Michelle, Martha, thank you again for being here.
Thank you, Sarah.
Thank you.